It is October 1942, somewhere along the Kokoda Track in the Owen Stanley Range of Papua New Guinea, and the rain has not stopped for 11 days. Mist clings to the kunai grass, and the jungle canopy drips in a steady, relentless rhythm that soldiers on both sides have learned to stop noticing. A Japanese officer of the Nankai Shitai, the South Seas Detachment, moves along a narrow ridge track that has turned to red clay soup beneath thousands of boots. His uniform is soaked through, his boots are rotting at the seams, and slung across his shoulder and chest is a brown leather holster containing his Type 14 Nambu pistol, the sidearm issued to him as a badge of rank as much as a weapon of war. He does not think about the holster. Why would he? It was manufactured to a specification approved in Tokyo, tested by men who had never set foot south of the Tropic of Cancer, and it has served faithfully since the day he first buckled it on. But somewhere beneath the flap, invisible to the eye, the vegetable-tanned cowhide is already losing its fight with the climate that surrounds him. The humidity here rarely drops below 90%. The heat by day can exceed 35 degrees Celsius. The leather, cured for a temperate empire, is absorbing moisture it was never designed to withstand, and the fibers that give it strength are beginning, quietly and invisibly, to break down. Records suggest that Japanese quartermasters had begun noting equipment failures of exactly this kind within months of the fighting reaching the tropics, and that among the items most affected were the leather harnesses, belts, and holsters carried by officers across the Pacific and Southeast Asian theaters. This is not a story about a single dramatic moment of loss, a pistol falling into a ravine or a river in front of witnesses whose names survive in the record. It is something quieter and, in its way, more revealing. It is the story of an empire's finest handgun, married to a piece of equipment that had been engineered for the wrong climate, and of what happens when the small, unglamorous details of soldiering, straps, stitching, rivets, and the chemistry of tanned hide are overlooked by planners fighting a war on the other side of the world. Few of the men who carried the Type 14 that day could have imagined that the greatest threat to their sidearm was not an enemy soldier at all, but the jungle itself, working silently on the leather against their chests. To understand why this mattered, it helps to understand what the Type 14 Nambu pistol was meant to represent for the Imperial Japanese Army. In the years after the First World War, Japan's military planners looked at their existing sidearms, the aging Type 26 double-action revolver adopted in 1893, and the so-called Grandpa Nambu automatic pistol, produced in small numbers from 1902, and concluded that neither was suitable for a modern, expanding officer corps. The Type 26 was underpowered and slow to reload. The early Nambu pistol, while more modern in concept, had never been adopted in large numbers and was expensive to produce by hand. Japan was rebuilding itself as an industrial and imperial power, and its army was growing to match those ambitions, eventually requiring hundreds of thousands of new officers, each of whom, by regulation and by custom, was expected to carry a private sidearm as a mark of his commission. General Kajiro Nambu, an engineer and army officer who had already designed Japan's earlier service pistols and would go on to found the company that became Minebiya, was tasked with refining his earlier work into something suitable for mass issue. The result, adopted by the Imperial Japanese Army in 1925 and by the Navy in 1927, and named for the 14th year of the Taisho era in which it was approved, was the Type 14. It fired an unusual bottlenecked 8mm cartridge, sending a bullet of roughly 100 grains at around 960 feet per second, modest figures by the standards of contemporary Western sidearms, and it was manufactured chiefly at the Nagoya Arsenal, with additional production later undertaken at the Koishikawa and Kokura arsenals as the war widened. Historians estimate that around 400,000 Type 14 pistols were produced in total between 1927 and 1945. a modest figure set against the more than 1 million M1911 pistols the United States alone would manufacture during the Second World War. And that disparity in industrial output tells its own story about the resources each nation could commit to something as seemingly minor as a sidearm. From its earliest service, the Type 14 carried real design weaknesses. Its safety catch required 2 hands to operate, an awkward feature for an officer under fire. Its magazine held only 8 rounds, without a hold-open device to signal an empty chamber. Most seriously, a magazine disconnect prevented the pistol from firing at all if the magazine was removed or lost, which meant that a spare magazine was arguably as important as the pistol itself, yet the standard holster provided no pocket to carry one. In the cold, dry conditions of Manchuria and northern China, where Japan's army fought through the 1930s, a different flaw dominated complaints from the field. The pistol's firing pin, thinned to save weight and metal, broke with such regularity in freezing temperatures that every Type 14 was eventually issued with a spare, tucked into a small leather slot built into the holster for exactly that purpose. The Type 14, in other words, was already a pistol built around compromise before a single shot was fired in the humid theaters where it would spend most of its combat life. The people who solved, or tried to solve, the problems of the Type 14 and its equipment were not glamorous figures. They were arsenal engineers, leather workers, and quartermaster staff working within a wartime economy that was rapidly running short of raw materials, and their solutions had to be practical, rather than elegant. The pistol itself was a relatively conventional locked-breech, recoil-operated design, weighing around 2¼ pounds loaded and measuring roughly 9 inches in length with a 4½ inch barrel, small enough to be worn comfortably beneath a tunic, yet substantial enough to serve as a visible symbol of an officer's authority. Its holster, however, tells the more interesting story for our purposes. Early Type 14 holsters were made from thick, high-quality cowhide, hardened into a rigid clamshell shape that opened on a hinge and closed with a leather flap and a metal stud or spring clip, worn either on a waist belt or slung from a canvas or leather shoulder strap across the chest. Inside, alongside the pistol itself, sat 2 compartments for spare ammunition and, as already noted, a narrow slot for the replacement firing pin. This was a well-considered piece of equipment for the environment in which it was first designed and tested. The temperate and often bitterly cold landscapes of the Japanese home islands, Korea, and Manchuria, where dry cold, not damp heat, was the leather's chief enemy. As Japan's war expanded southwards from 1941 into Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and the island chains of the Pacific, that same leather was suddenly required to perform in exactly the conditions it had never been tested against: extreme humidity, near-constant rainfall, and the biological activity of fungi and bacteria that thrive in tropical warmth and moisture. Vegetable-tanned leather, kept damp for long periods without proper drying or conditioning, loses tensile strength as its collagen fibers degrade, and stitching threads, often made from waxed cotton or hemp rather than synthetic fiber, rot even more quickly than the hide surrounding them. By the middle years of the war, wartime shortages of cattle hide compounded the problem still further, since raw materials that might once have gone into thicker, better-cured leather were increasingly diverted or simply unavailable. Japanese arsenals responded from around 1942 onward by introducing a substitute holster made from rubberized canvas, layers of woven cotton fabric bonded with natural latex, which collectors and historians have since nicknamed the jungle-type holster. It is worth being precise about the historical record here. Surviving accounts and equipment specialists note that this material was not originally developed with tropical warfare specifically in mind, but rather as a response to a shortage of cowhide across the whole of the Japanese war economy. What is well documented, however, is that this same rubberized canvas turned out, largely by circumstance rather than design, to resist the humidity of the Pacific far better than the leather it replaced, which continued to soften, crack, and rot wherever it remained in service. For the men who actually carried these pistols across the string of battles that defined the Pacific War, from the jungles of Guadalcanal in 1942 to the mountains of New Guinea, the beaches of Peleliu, and the last defensive lines on Okinawa in 1945, this was not an abstract materials problem, but a daily, physical reality. War diaries and post-war equipment surveys describe officers whose leather gear, from boots to belts to holsters, softened and split within weeks of arriving in a tropical theater, and quartermaster reports from these campaigns repeatedly flag leather equipment as a maintenance burden disproportionate to its cost. Exact figures for how many sidearms were lost specifically because a rotted strap gave way, or a softened flap failed to hold its closure during a river crossing, or a headlong retreat through the jungle, do not survive in any reliable, comprehensive form, and historians continue to debate how large a role equipment failure of this kind played compared with the simple chaos, exhaustion, and loss of organized supply that characterized Japan's later Pacific campaigns. What can be said with confidence is that the problem was significant enough to prompt a change in standard issue equipment during the war itself, that surviving examples of both leather and rubberized canvas, Type 14 holsters bear physical evidence, in their stitching, their surface condition, and their construction, of this attempted fix, and that Japanese officers serving in the tropics carried a piece of equipment whose weakest point was not its trigger, its safety, or even its notoriously fragile firing pin, but the simple leather strap holding it against their body. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. Seen alongside the sidearms and holsters of Japan's allies and adversaries, the Type 14's difficulties come into sharper focus. The United States equipped its officers with the M1911 and M1911A1, a considerably more powerful pistol firing a heavier .45 caliber round, carried in holsters made variously from leather and, increasingly as the war progressed, from tough olive drab canvas webbing that shrugged off tropical moisture far more readily than tanned hide. American quartermasters had already learned hard lessons about leather equipment in humid environments during earlier colonial campaigns in the Philippines, and much of the U.S. Army's webbing and holster design by the Second World War reflected that experience. Germany's officers carried the Walther P38 or the older Luger P08, generally in well-made leather holsters that performed adequately on the European and North African fronts, but were never subjected to the sustained tropical punishment that Japan's Pacific War inflicted on its own equipment. The Soviet Union's Tokarev TT-33, produced in vast numbers and carried in a simple, rugged leather holster, served across climates ranging from Arctic to subtropical, and while Soviet accounts also describe leather degradation in warmer southern theaters, the scale of the Eastern Front's fighting meant equipment attrition of every kind was simply absorbed into a much larger picture of loss. Britain's Webley revolvers, carried by officers across a genuinely global empire that included tropical postings in India, Burma, and Malaya, benefited from more than a century of accumulated colonial experience in designing and maintaining leather equipment for humid climates, including established routines of oiling, airing, and rotating kit, that Japanese logistics, stretched thin and improvised at speed across a rapidly expanding empire, struggled to replicate. None of this reflects a single nation's soldiers being braver or better prepared than another's. It reflects instead differences in institutional memory, industrial depth, and the sheer amount of time each army had spent fighting in the specific climates its equipment would ultimately be tested in. It is also worth noting that raw stopping power and holster durability were not the only measures by which these sidearms differed. The Type 14's magazine disconnect, absent from the M1911, the Luger, and the Tokarev alike, meant that a Japanese officer who lost or dropped his magazine in a jungle stream was left holding a pistol that could not fire at all, compounding the practical consequences of any equipment failure in a way that Allied and Soviet officers, whose weapons remained functional with a round already chambered, did not generally share. Japanese naval officers, who received their own variant holsters and, in some cases, privately purchased superior leather equipment rather than rely solely on standard Army issue, appear in surviving photographs and museum collections to have fared somewhat better, a detail that hints at how individual initiative and personal wealth could partially offset the shortcomings of standard issue kit, though the historical record on this point remains patchy and largely anecdotal rather than systematically documented. The wider significance of this small, easily overlooked story lies less in any single battle and more in what it reveals about the demands of global warfare on industrial and logistical planning. Japan's military expansion after 1931 moved its soldiers, in the space of little more than a decade, from the frozen plains of Manchuria to the equatorial jungles of the South Pacific, a shift in operating environment that few procurement systems of the era were equipped to anticipate fully. The Type 14 Nambu and its troubled holster stand as a modest but telling example of a much larger pattern seen across many armies of the period, in which equipment optimized for one theater proved poorly suited to another, and adaptation had to happen under the pressure of active campaigning, rather than through calm peacetime testing. The rubberized canvas holster that emerged as Japan's wartime fix would find echoes in post-war military equipment design generally, as armies around the world increasingly turned to synthetic and treated materials specifically engineered to resist heat, humidity, and fungal decay, a design philosophy that owes something, even if indirectly, to hard lessons learned in places like New Guinea and Burma. Today, surviving Type 14 pistols and their holsters, both the leather originals and the later rubberized canvas variants, are preserved in military museums and private collections across the world, including examples held by institutions such as the Imperial War Museum in London, where their catalogued dimensions and conditions still bear witness to the materials and manufacturing choices made under wartime pressure. Exact numbers of surviving examples remain uncertain, scattered as they are across battlefields, museums, and collections built up over 80 years, but their physical condition, brittle stitching, cracked leather, hardened rubber, continues to offer historians and conservators tangible evidence of exactly the kind of environmental stress this documentary has described. Specialist collectors who study Japanese military leatherwork today can often date and place a surviving holster by the very defects that once made it unreliable in the field, reading the pattern of stitching, the type of closure clip, and the presence or absence of a rubberized panel as a kind of material timeline of Japan's deteriorating wartime supply situation. In that sense, the humble holster has become an unlikely but genuinely useful historical document in its own right, corroborating what quartermaster records and veteran accounts describe in words with what conservators can now observe directly in surviving leather and rubber. Return for a moment to that officer on the Kokoda track, soaked through, his holster darkened with rain, the Type 14 Nambu resting against his chest exactly as Army regulations intended. He carried, in that single piece of equipment, the full weight of what his nation had achieved and what it had failed to anticipate. The pistol itself represented genuine engineering ambition, a Japanese-designed, Japanese-built sidearm intended to arm an entire generation of officers with a weapon equal to those carried by the world's other great powers. Yet the leather holding it against his body told a different story, one of an empire that had expanded faster than its logistics could comfortably follow, carrying equipment designed for the cold plains of the continent into a climate that quietly, patiently, and without any drama at all, worked to undo it. There is no surviving evidence confirming precisely how many officers lost their sidearms to failed straps and rotted stitching, rather than to combat, capture, or simple wartime chaos. And historians are right to be cautious about attributing too much to any single cause when so much was going wrong for Japan's forces by the middle years of the Pacific War. But the pattern is clear enough in the surviving equipment, in the arsenal records of substitute materials rushed into production, and in the accounts of quartermasters wrestling with supply lines stretched across an ocean, to tell us something true and worth remembering. Wars are not only won or lost through the courage of soldiers or the brilliance of commanders. They are shaped, in ways rarely celebrated and even more rarely filmed, by threads and stitching, by the chemistry of tanned hide, by the humidity of a jungle afternoon, and by the quiet, unglamorous work of the men who tried, often too late, to adapt old equipment to a new and unforgiving world. The Type 14 Nambu survived the war as a symbol, sitting today behind museum glass or in the careful hands of collectors, its leather cracked, its stitching frayed, still recognizably the pistol it always was. But look closely at the holster beside it, and you are looking at something rarer than the weapon itself. A small physical record of an empire that learned, one broken strap at a time, that the greatest threats to a soldier's equipment do not always arrive carrying a rifle.